Hello again. I'm Maggie Meggs, Director of the Forest Dwelling Program here at Oblate School of Theology. This is the first of two videos in the series, Wandering in the Forest, Grieving Our Losses, and Letting Go. There's much soul work to be done as we grow older, perhaps outliving family, friends, and our cherished ways of living. The spirituality of aging gives us the opportunity to make holy this ordinary time of decline and loss and come to peace within ourselves, something not everyone who is aging will be able to do. Let's continue our pilgrimage together. I'd like to begin with this prayer from Reverend Mary Earle, one of our core faculty in the program. It's from her book, Marvelously Made. Reverend Mary has a deep reverence and understanding of the wonders of the body, which God has marvelously made. In her book, there are prayers and meditation for the major parts of the body, and I turn to it when a particular part of mine needs some tender, loving care. Because we associate the heart with grief and pain, I thought her prayer for the heart would be a fitting start for this session. It takes a strong heart to live through the challenges of aging, and many of us have or will have heart disease as well. Gracious God, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I thank you for my heart, for all the minutes, days, hours that it has beat within me. I thank you for the marvel of its structure and for the wonder of its work. I remember this day all whose hearts labor from malfunction and disease, and give thanks for those who tend them. Amen. Drinking the Tears of the World is a compelling image from Francis Weller's book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. As we know, there's much to lament in our current world, though each of us are affected by it in different ways. In the first series, I talked about the movement from an individual perspective to one of shared humanity as part of a maturing spirituality. For instance, most of the people listening to this video are not living in a place of war or famine, yet we are called as elders to grieve for all those caught up in the greed, injustice, and hate in the world. Your willingness represents a service for those who may not have that perspective or the cushion to allow time and space for their grief. Weller talks about the spiritual work in this way. Coming home to grief is sacred work, a powerful practice that confirms what the indigenous soul knows and what spiritual traditions teach. We are connected to one another. Our fates are bound together in a mysterious but recognizable way. Grief registers the many ways this depth of kinship is assaulted daily. Grief work becomes a core element in our ability to sustain and maintain the well-being of our communities. It's a central means whereby our compassion is quickened and our mutual suffering acknowledged. It's also a form of soul protest, our wholehearted response to acts of violence and oppression. He goes on to say, if we refuse or neglect the responsibility for drinking the tears of the world, her losses cease to be registered by the ones meant to be the receptors of that information. It is our job to feel these losses and to mourn them. In one of his talks for Forest Dwelling, Father Ron Rolheiser speaks about the reality of encountering a death or circumstance which is unspeakable, like the death of a young child, a murder, a natural disaster. This, he says, is a time not for platitudes, but for lamentation, which he poetically describes as a time to lay down, Put your face in the dust and weep. There's an inchoate depth of sorrow that no words can speak to, yet it's essential to offer your silent presence in those times. You become a human witness to God's presence in the midst of suffering. Be willing to stand in the suffering without answers. Metaphorically, lay in the dust and weep with that person who is brokenhearted. It's enough to be soulfully present. A recent example for me was the attempted assassination of a presidential candidate by a young man who was so wounded by life that he shot and killed, knowing he would be killed as well. As I watched the news, horrified, I moved into a posture of lamenting, as I do every time I hear of another mass shooting. No answers, no solutions, just lamenting until there is time for action as that may arise. I could not get to that posture earlier in life, just anger, despair, or turning my head. As we become more willing to bear witness to the sorrows of humanity, it is good to remember why we have been given this gift of tears. It's not just to keep our eye sockets wet. There is something miraculous and bonding about crying, yet many of us have been taught to either hold in the tears or only cry in private. One of our core faculty, Dr. Marilyn McIntyre, wrote a powerful book titled A Faithful Farewell from her experience working in a hospice setting. She writes in the first person to keep the stories alive and relatable. In one chapter, she writes of the importance, challenges, and gifts of being willing to cry. She says, "People speak of the gift of tears. I don't like to cry. I tend to weep in private and to avoid crying when I'm with others, even those who know me best. But perhaps there is a time to weep is part of what I need to learn now. Tears release me into honest sorrow. They release me into a childlike place where I need to be held and can find comfort in embrace, in the arms of others and in the arms of God. I want to learn to accept that gift, the cleansing, the release, the sharing of sorrow, the opening of the heart it brings, and rest in the one who wept with us, who weeps with us, but who also promised that finally every tear will be wiped away." And Dr. Marilyn offers us this prayer. "Receive my tears, Jesus, when they come, and let them join with the great river of your own sorrow for a world in pain. I thank you for the gift of tears, as I also thank you for the joy that does come still, even with the breaking light of every earthly morning I am given. Amen." I have listed a few losses that will bear fruit if we acknowledge their presence and bring our grief to the altar of sorrow. We cannot heal what we don't know is present. And though many of us would prefer that our unconscious pain stays buried, it's life-giving to acknowledge what is there. It becomes the evidence of a fully human life. It's not meant to be just the good things that we acknowledge. There's no wholeness in that posture. As a psychologist, as a person, as a spiritual seeker, I have seen the wonders of the healing that comes from meeting brokenness with compassion and allowing the tenderness of God to shine light in the darkness. This is the spiritual path leading us from feeling broken to being broken open. It's also the story of Jesus's life and ministry. Pain, loss, suffering, healing, wholeness, and holiness are intimately related. Throw in some joy, and to experience them all is like a living collage of divine love. I do want to make a comment that there is not only one way to grieve. Some people truly are more comfortable and inclined to feel and express their emotions, including sorrow that results in tears. As I mentioned in the first set of videos, there are gender differences, and men in particular have likely been socialized to be ashamed of their tears. I've worked with men who find it less disturbing to cry in the shower, letting their tears fall in with the cleansing water. It's also true that some people express their feelings in what is called an instrumental way. They do it through actions. For example, as they literally chop wood or run or some other activity. They know they are grieving. So don't assume they aren't, because there are no visible tears. However you do it, just don't suppress or deny your grief. It's definitely not good for you. At age 42, my father had a heart attack in the year after my brother was killed, having suppressed his grief in a show of supposed strength. But he was truly brokenhearted, unable to attend to his deep suffering, and that was the way it expressed itself physically. I invite you to pause the video at this time and make your own list of what you may need to grieve. What are your losses as you are aging? Sit quietly and pay attention to what arises in you. I want to take a moment to acknowledge one of the most, if not the most painful loss a person can experience, and that is the death of a child. Pat Timpanaro, one of our elders in the third cohort, lost her 46-year-old son, Jeff, on September 1st, 2016. Parents are not supposed to outlive their children, and Pat has lived this nightmare, as I am sure some of you have as well. My heart goes out to all of you. In her 80s now, Pat has turned her terrible wound into a sacred wound as she is on her own healing path. And she now offers workshops through the Compassionate Friends, a self-help group for parents who have lost children. She has discovered that writing poetry brings healing and comfort to her and to others. This description of a recent class at a Compassionate Friends workshop says it well. I have been enrolled in the classroom of grief for almost 8 years now. I did not want to sign up for this class, but it is required in the program of life. There is no course syllabus and no set curriculum. There is no assigned textbook, and you are encouraged to write your own script. You can join a study group of other students, but some of the coursework must be done by you in solitude. There are many tests along the way, but there is no final exam because the class never ends. There are pop-up quizzes that take you by surprise. The grades you get on them don't really matter because there are no right or wrong answers. It helps at times to talk to people who have been enrolled in this class longer than you. They will keep you safe and, most importantly, listen to you. They will be attentive because they listen with their hearts. Even though there is no graduation day, you will slowly feel yourself changed by this class. You will begin to notice others who join up, and you will want to help them understand how challenging the class is, and yet how life-giving as well. Any prerequisites, you ask? The only prerequisite is love. Powerful, huh? Though you may not experience the agony of a child's death, you may know someone who has or will. As an elder, you need to do your part and show up for that person, for any of your friends or family who are grieving other losses. If you have lost a spouse or a parent early in life, or someone you have not yet grieved, Pat's wise words can help you too. She has recently written a beautiful summary of her spiritual journey through her son Jeff's loss. It's full of wisdom and full of grace, and would make an excellent resource for anyone you know who is grieving the loss of a loved one. Emmett will include a link when you get the email for this video if you would like to have it. I want to share an example of how you can support someone in their grief by simple actions. During COVID, my neighbor's young daughter was accidentally shot and killed by her acquaintance. Horrifying. I went over immediately upon hearing the news and sat with them. I placed a plant at their doorstep on the monthly anniversary of her death for a year, and I attend their memorial for Maddie each year since. Have the courage to face your own pain as you give them the gift of remembering their loved one. I want to provide a bridge between the topic of grieving and the importance of coming to terms with our reluctance to let go of things, especially the illusion that we can control what happens in life. The spiritual teacher, Gangaji, says that realizing that we have no control is a major step in mature spirituality. I cringe just saying those words because I desperately want to believe that I do have control. Of course, she makes a distinction between having no control at all and having limited control, or what she calls supporting. For instance, we cannot control our health completely, but we can do things to support it. We can't control who gets elected president, but we can vote. We can't save all the people who are suffering from being unhoused, but we can support the agencies who provide shelter. She notes that trying to control something or someone results in misery, while being supportive brings joy or a sense of peace. Ask anyone who recites the Serenity Prayer. Lord, give me the courage to change the things I can, the serenity to accept the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. The wisdom to know the difference between supporting a loved one in ways that are not enabling him or her is not easy. Trying to make a person change who isn't ready is heartbreaking, but you add misery on top of that if you do. Similarly, trying to make people stop being disrespectful can be quite maddening, often leading to disrespect on your own part. So let's try something different. Let's consider this wisdom from the Thai Buddhist monk, Ajahn Chah, who says, if you let go a little, you will have a little peace. If you let go a lot, you will have a lot of peace. If you let go completely, you will have complete peace and freedom, and your struggles with the world will have come to an end. You may want to stop the video and make a list of things or people or circumstances you are consciously or unconsciously trying to control or fix. What are you doing to try to control the situation? to fix it? Is it helping? If not, what would moving into a posture of supporting look like instead? When I was working as a therapist, I listened for what people thought would be helpful to solve a problem they were bringing to therapy. People always had an idea of what should work, and when it didn't, they would usually keep trying the same thing, only harder. Of course, if it doesn't work, it won't work, no matter how hard you try it. By helping them to let go of that approach, it created space to find something that might. Of course, sometimes the discovery was that all they could do was to hold the unsolvable problem or person in care-filled, compassionate attention. It didn't change the circumstance, but it relieved some of the pain they were holding, bringing a bit of peace to their hearts and minds. In Al-Anon, they call this detaching with love. You may also want to explore where you stand on this idea that realizing that we have no real control is a sign of spiritual maturity. What comes up when you consider letting go of control in a situation that is troubling? Does that mean you don't care or that you're giving up? And how does this fit in with surrendering to God's will? I will say that the Elder Circle leaders and I agree that letting go of the tendency to try to control and fix things is probably something we will work on until we die. How about you? Do you remember being taught the 3 R's when you were in elementary school? Reading, writing, and arithmetic, in case you don't. Over the years, I realized that there are also 3 R's to work on in the autumn and winter of life. But these involve letting go of regrets, resentments, and resistance to what is happening. This is truly soul work. And lightening the load will make it a much easier path through this stage of life. As I started looking closely at how they show up in my life, at first it was kind of disheartening. As I continue to work on my regrets, resentments, and resistance, I'm beginning to see the gift of letting go, of settling up with as many as I can, and learning to be more self-compassionate when they arise. We'll touch on releasing regret in this video and the other 2 in the next. A word of caution: please seek out the help of someone who can be there for you if there is anything that is too painful to go alone. Most of us can be harder on ourselves than on anyone else, and this can be painful spiritual work. I'm going to say a few words about regrets to set the stage. Regrets are those choices, words, actions which we did or did not do and continue to bring pain, and most characteristically, a sense of guilt. In my experience, there are differences in the type of guilt people feel. The first is what is called real guilt. In other words, it's the guilt that happens when we have caused harm through our action or inaction. The second type is called neurotic guilt. And this is the type of guilt that we take on even though the harm was not really of our doing, yet we carry it as if it were. One example is the guilt children may carry into adulthood, thinking that their parents' divorce was their fault when it was clearly not. Another example is the guilt my father carried for the death of my brother, Even though Dad was nowhere near the scene of the accident that killed him, Dad felt like it was his responsibility to protect Arthur, as many parents feel when their child dies. This guilt tortured him for many, many years. Neurotic guilt might show up in words like, if only I had, or it's my fault that. Real or neurotic, the guilt is painful. The last one, existential guilt, is an interesting one that results from the forced choices we sometimes have to make, which are mutually exclusive, even if we might like to have both options or neither one of them. There's a truism that highlights this. Saying yes to one thing always means saying no to another. A common example is the parent who says yes to their work, which is necessary to help support the family, which also means no to being completely available to their children. Some of you may have regrets about what you missed out in your children's lives as you worked long hours. Sometimes life gives us terrible choices. I believe we do the best we can with the choices we make, even when they cause unintentional but real harm. I also know that with the wisdom I have today, I would have made some different choices when I was younger. That's just part of the human story. Don't forget to take that into consideration when you are judging yourself. Instead, let it open you to the tender presence of a God who loves you unconditionally. Perhaps you may want to pause the video now and begin listing some of your regrets. Remember, be gentle and know that everyone has regrets. And most people have at least a couple that are more troubling and painful than the others. In her book, A Faithful Farewell, Dr. Marilyn touches poignantly on the regrets she found people struggling with on their deathbeds. She writes for them, every week, the pastor offers this familiar reassurance. Friends, believe the good news. In Jesus Christ, you are forgiven. I rely on that. I rely on God's infinite mercy when my own checkered past rises up to haunt me. I bear in my body and psyche the marks and scars of a life imperfectly lived and deep regrets over lost opportunities and the hard fact that we don't get to erase mistakes and redo the past. I have to accept forgiveness. It's the only release from self-condemnation. For me, accepting forgiveness isn't altogether simple. There is still the psychological residue of regret. I wish I hadn't. That list is a long one. The best thing I can do with it is to turn it into a long testimony to God's faithfulness, how consistently God has allowed good things to take root and blossom in the rubble of my past. Can you pause for a moment and reflect on the various regrets you have listed and ponder the evidence of God's faithfulness in the midst of them? What good things have taken root from the rubble of those past regrets? Sometimes it's merely a feeling of compassion for others who have done regretful things, even if there is nothing more to be done than that. In his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Francis Weller describes regrets as a source of deep and abiding loss. Living with regret is a heavy sadness, like walking through a graveyard of loss. Think about that reality, carrying a heavy sadness. What does that bring up for you as you think of someone you love having to carry such sadness? It often brings up a sense of compassion for them. And sometimes it's harder to feel compassion for ourselves. And yet that is what is called for. Weller writes that our regrets require the soft hands of self-compassion. Kindness and mercy are soothing medicines in the room of regret. As Dr. Marilyn also said, forgiving yourself is not a pure act of will. Both she and Weller speak to the work of creating the space for the grace to forgive yourself. Buddhism emphasizes over and over the need for self-compassion, and spiritual teachers from the West, including Christianity, are recognizing the need for us to open the gates for self-compassion in order to accept the grace of God's mercy. Ask yourself this: what might you do to create conditions which open the doors to self-forgiveness? This often involves uncovering the beliefs and rules that you have learned over the years. Some of them definitely need to be updated. I work on this a lot because there's a young part of me that still believes that I deserve to be punished. There's a lot of that archetypal energy in the world. Just pay attention and you will see it. Richard Rohr helped me to see the difference between restorative and retributive justice. The punisher within seeks the latter. God seeks the former. I've included this slide because it helps us to realize that right now is the time to make choices about how we spend the time between now and the terminal diagnosis. Don't wait for that to take stock of how you are living. I forget the name of the person I heard talk about this when I was driving in the car, but she talked about what she calls pregrets. In other words, is there anything you would regret not having done before you die? And I'm not talking about a bucket list. Earlier in life, I would have answered not getting my doctorate. Today, it goes more like not truly appreciating and savoring this wonderful life I have been given. So I invite you to pause now and reflect on this. What might you regret as you are laying on your deathbed? And what can you do about that now? Here are a few more ideas to help you let go of, to make peace with regrets that continue to weigh you down. Dr. Marilyn has touched on the first of these. Feel the pain and let the balm of God's faithfulness and mercy be present. It may be helpful to have a dialogue with Jesus or the Holy Spirit or some other loving presence and express your feelings of shame and unworthiness. This is often at the core of regrets. You can also journal or speak out loud on a walk or sitting in a park by yourself. Research has shown that there is something different in speaking aloud or writing something down than just thinking about it. People who attend AA know that there is a weight lifted by acknowledging the harm you have done to someone. But they emphasize that it should only be done when it would not do additional harm to the person. There are some cases where the best choice is to do your inner work, asking for their forgiveness, and then forgive yourself without contacting the other. Just be sure you don't skip over the pain you caused them and do it wholeheartedly. You may need to do that more than once, and some ritual, like writing it down and burning the letter as an offering for forgiveness, may be useful. In the various forms of Alcoholics Anonymous, Al-Anon, Codependence Anonymous, etc., they ask that you share that with your sponsor. And that may also be something that's helpful, to find someone you trust enough that you can do that with. Now, one of my longtime mentors had a saying to describe the hard work of addressing deep wounds. She would say that we can turn shit into gold by feeling the pain and allowing the alchemy of healing to occur. A final note is the recognition that I am human too, and no human is without regret. My ego calls this humiliation. My soul recognizes humility. Grief is a powerful solvent, capable of softening the hardest of places in our hearts. When we can truly weep for ourselves and those places of shame, we have invited the first soothing waters of healing to wash through our souls. Grieving, by its very nature, confirms worth. I am worth crying over. My losses matter. Let us all say a loving yes to the story of our imperfect lives, and let our guilt be transformed into new life in our current relationships and within ourselves. I find this prayer from Dr. Marilyn to be illuminating. You who made us out of dust and entered into the muddy business of human living, make my story, with all its subplots and shadows, a gift to those who remember me. Heal my regrets and theirs with a miracle of new seeing, turning brokenness to beauty and bitterness to acceptance. Amen. I want to finish with this beautiful poem by one of the women in the Forest Dwelling program. She's using the gift of poetry as she moves through her own time of healing, and Donna graciously offers it to those who are also on the journey. Unbecoming. Sit with me in this place of unbecoming, this very unbecoming place, this place from which I ache to escape through some distraction. Uncomfortable, antsy, squirmy, I want to wriggle away, or better yet, take flight into fantasy, soaring somewhere high above the messiness of life. I want to be anywhere but in this sameness, these doldrums, waiting for the wave I fear will capsize and drown me. You tell me to welcome this and all feelings. Yes, but, I reply, it does not feel good. I want to make meaning out of these times and the dissatisfaction they provoke. But you say, That is not the point, at least not initially. There will be time for that later. Right now, feel the angst, feel the despair, feel the loneliness, feel the grief, and do not rush to gratitude. That only prolongs the lesson. Be here now. Be somewhere else later. You have to unbecome before you can become your authentic self. So for now, sit in the darkness of unbecoming. Get to know it well. Befriend it. Give it space. Make room for the unraveling of all you thought you knew, how you thought things would be, and your expectations for the future. Rest in the unbecoming. There is nowhere else you need to be. There is nothing else you need to do. There is nothing to figure out or fix. There is just this unbecoming. I want to thank you so much for being part of this first video, and I hope you have time to reflect on some of the ideas I touched on, and I look forward to sharing our next video, which will be released next week. Until then, may you be blessed by a holy unfolding on your own journey. See you soon.